Our speaker today is Matthias Doepke, a professor of economics at Northwestern University. Born and raised in Germany, he first came to the United States to study economics at the University of Chicago. Doepke's research explores how decisions taken within families shape macroeconomic outcomes and how, in turn, economic conditions feed back into what families do. He is co-author with Fabrizio Zilibati of Love, Money, and Parenting, How Economics Explains the Way We Raise Our Kids. Please welcome Matthias Doepke.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you about my book with my longtime co-author Fabrizio Zilibati. So you may start by wondering what two economists could possibly have to say about parenting. It seems a bit odd at first sight. Now there's some professional interest because things that families do have important economic implications. You know, we started out as economists working on growth and economic development, the question of why some countries are poor and others are rich. And there are things like population growth, for example, is very important. You know, if you have very large families, it's going to be harder to get high wealth levels. Having small families where people invest a lot in education is going to be a more promising approach. So we long had these professional interests in families, but the motivation for this book really came also from personal experience, and in particular the huge contrast we saw between the way we were raised ourselves back in the 70s and 80s compared to how we raise our children right now. So I grew up in Germany, as you may have guessed from the accent, in the 70s and 80s. Fabrizio is Italian, so just a few hundred miles away from where I was. Different places, but the parenting we were exposed to was very similar. It was very relaxed, very much about freedom and independence. Now, my parents gave us food in the morning. They expected us to be home before dark, and that was the extent of parenting, pretty much. You know, you had a few hours of school, you went off to play soccer with friends, went to their houses. As long as you didn't go into major trouble, didn't put something on fire, you were pretty much on your own. You know, things like homework, I didn't really do it that much. Nobody cared. My parents really wouldn't think of it as their job to make sure that I do my homework. Now, homework is my job. They have their own jobs. It was a different sphere. It was a lot of independence and freedom for kids at that time. It was, even in the United States, if you talk to Americans who grew up about my age, they will tell you something very similar. That it was a lot more relaxed than it is nowadays. And this way of being raised was actually a lot of fun. You know, we had a great time as kids. It was nice to be with friends. It was nice to have room to have your own discovery, your own interest. We thought this was really a great way to be raised, and we somehow expected that we would be very similar as parents in our own lives. But then, many years later, we had our own children, and as parents, turns out that we were quite different. You know, so now we have kids. Fabrizio has a daughter who's now in college. We have 3 sons, and in our own parenting, we're a lot more intense. You know, we actually do pay attention to homework. We make sure they do this stuff. We spend so much more time with our kids than our own parents did. So our own parenting style is now a lot like this modern, intensive helicopter parenting you read about compared to what we experienced and what we thought was a good idea. And so we wonder, you know, why is it that we all of a sudden behave in such a different way? Now, we are economists, and economics is a social science that is about how people make decisions. You know, so we wondered, well, can maybe economics explain something about why our behavior has changed so much, and why we have seen so much changes in the world around us more generally in terms of how people parent their kids. So this is what this book tries to do. Now, traditionally, economics is applied to mostly economic decisions such as making money and running a business, but the way of economic thinking you can apply to many different ways of behavior. And in fact, Gary Becker, who was one of my thesis advisors at the University of Chicago, is the economist who first introduced this idea of applying economics to much more wider ranges of behavior, and what we are doing here in some sense follows on his ideas of using economics more as a method as opposed to a particular range of topics. Now, what does it mean to think economically about the decision making? You know, what really is characteristic about economics as a social science is that we think of people as being broadly purposeful, broadly rational in terms of how they decide. Now, when we analyze some decision, we have the view that people have an objective they're trying to accomplish, that they face certain constraints, they have a limited amount of money, maybe a limited amount of knowledge, and so what they're going to do is what is best to get to the objective given the constraints they face. When you think about how in economics we think about how firms are being run, we say, well, the entrepreneur tries to maximize profits. There is some constraints from technology, from competition, from what the market is like, and we predict behavior based on what makes sense, what is rational, given the constraints and given your objective. That's the way of thinking in economics, and what we want to do is to apply the same way of thinking to parents. I should say a second important part of the economic thinking is that we think of the preferences, so the objectives we pursue, as being broadly fixed, that we have usually the same things in mind. So if there's a change in behavior, we tend to attribute those to changes in the environment, the constraints that we face. The world has changed, and this gives us reasons to come to different answers. So we want to apply this way of thinking to parenting, and here's how we do this. We have to first start with, what is the objective of parenting? And now, of course, as an economist, you might expect me to say it's about money. We want to have kids working hard and maybe giving us money when we're old. Those things may play some role, but they're probably very minor. I think we can agree that for the most part, what parents want to accomplish is for the kids to do well, because we love our kids, we like them, we want them to do well, and so our ultimate objective is for kids to thrive and do well. But in accomplishing this objective, just like an entrepreneur does, we do face constraints, because we have limited resources. Some things cost money, like expensive private schools, for example. We also have limited time. We also have maybe limited information about what we should do. Even more importantly, we are also constrained by the overall economic environment, by the world that we live in. What it actually means to be successful, what skills, what attitudes are going to be beneficial for a child in their future lives is going to depend on the society that we are exposed to. And so we're going to argue that changes in the society, in particular economic changes, are actually going to explain a lot about why parenting has changed. And so we started writing this book without quite knowing how far we could get, because of course this economic perspective is just one possible way of explaining behavior. This is a way of explaining behavior that is very purposeful, where we say people trying to make decisions in a very, essentially rational way, whereas other people might say, well, maybe it's something more driven by tradition or culture or things that come from somewhere else. If you talk to sociologists, for example, they will have a slightly different view of the world. And so in the end, the question is about the data and how much does the data support this way of thinking as opposed to maybe other factors being important. What we came away from with this book is that economics actually works remarkably well at explaining parenting decisions, maybe even more so than many other more traditional economic decisions. And the reason I think that's so is that how well this kind of rational, purposeful approach works, I think depends to some extent on how high the stakes are. How much does it matter to actually get a decision right versus wrong? Think about another economic decision. So one thing that we often decide on that is important for, say, macroeconomic policy is savings decisions. When you think about the impact that some say change in the interest rate set by the Federal Reserve has on behavior, well, it matters how people react to change in interest rates in their savings behavior. In principle, when interest rates go up, it makes sense to save more. There's a higher return to savings, and so sometimes maybe people do that. But in reality, often we don't. I personally actually have no idea what interest rate I'm currently getting paid on my checkings or savings accounts. I never adjust my behavior after the central bank does something. I've probably not adjusted my 401k portfolio allocation in 5-6 years or so. I don't do those things, and not because I don't care, but just because the stakes for my overall life are actually quite low. How much does it matter for my life to improve my allocation to 401k a little bit? Has really very little impact on my overall welfare. Might make me, give me a few more $1,000s in 20 years or so. That's not really going to have a material impact on my life. In comparison, my kids, I care about a lot. I think about my kids every day. I think about their future lives every day. It's something that really matters a lot. If I do something wrong, if I somehow have the wrong approach and mess up their lives, that will have a huge impact on my welfare and on theirs. So it's something where I'm really much more conscious about what I'm doing, and I think this kind of active thinking about my kids is really what makes this approach in the end have more power. And just to be clear, we don't mean that people do this in a very direct way. Now, I don't really say that people have an Excel spreadsheet where they kind of list advantages of one parenting style versus the other, take the balance and make the optimal thing. It's an implicit thing that you think about your kids, you think about the world that they face, and your decisions end up being kind of consistent with what makes sense given the world that you face. It's not super explicit, but it ends up working quite well. Okay, and I want to show you, some data that does support this. I should also say that one thing we don't do in this book is to give parenting advice. Now, most books about parenting are about advice. It's about the notion that the person who has written the book knows a lot about parenting and will now tell you what you're doing wrong and what you should be doing better. The nature of the economic approach is exactly not to do that, because we do think that people know what they're doing. The whole economic approach is to say people have objectives and what they do makes sense. And so we're going to say people are doing the right thing given the world they live in. It's just our job as social scientists to understand why they're doing this. So it's not trying to judge or change behavior. It's just trying to understand the reasons. And of course, you can always find examples where maybe you don't agree with this. You probably know some parents where you think, well, maybe they should be doing this different. But I really do believe that by and large this is right. When I look at people I know, other parents, I think they are trying to do the right thing. I think they are doing the right thing given the world that we live in now. Now, this fact of not giving advice does not mean that everything is perfect, because it's completely possible that people are doing the right thing from their own perspective, but that still at the level of a society something goes wrong. You could have a situation where, for example, you have a zero-sum rat race kind of situation for getting into top colleges that makes people spend tons of effort on getting into this place that is not really beneficial for society, but is still something that makes sense from their perspective. And you might still say the overall situation is wrong. Maybe we should change the rules. Maybe we should redesign some of the society to get better outcomes for everybody. So I'm not going to say that everything is perfect. It's just going to say we don't blame the parents. We think the parents are doing the best they can. And it's really a question of how their behavior is informed by the society around them. Okay, but I want to show you how this works. So I want to show you some basic facts, about how parenting has changed, and then tell you that the data, in fact, I think supports our implications. Now, let me give you a 3-slide overview of the history of parenting. How has parenting changed throughout human society? That's actually pretty easy to do, because for most of history, nothing has changed. When you read about how parents raised their kids from beginning of written records until about 200 years ago, nothing changed. There was one parenting style that was dominant, and it's what the psychologists call authoritarian parenting. So there's a historian, Plum, who looked at 200 different books that give advice to parents in different time periods, different societies, different religious backgrounds. And he looks at what they recommend, and he finds that all but 3 of those 200 books recommend that fathers should beat their children. It's not just it's okay to do it. No, it's really required as a step to good raising of kids to be very forceful, indeed violent in making your view felt. The Bible says the same thing. If you are a father who does not beat the son, you're actually doing something wrong. You are letting, kind of the wrong kind of child grow up. So very clear authoritarian views until quite recently. At some point, there was some new ideas about parenting and child rearing, mostly from theoretical writers like Rousseau and Montessori. But then over time, these things did change parenting, and so we see that the authoritarian approach loses some popularity over time, mostly in the 20th century, mostly actually after World War II, leading to this phase of fairly relaxed parenting that I experienced myself. So in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, we see that permissive parenting, that was sometimes also called anti-authoritarian parenting, became quite popular. And that's kind of the phase where I grew up and where Fabrizio grew up. So here's me barely dressed out in the countryside, maybe 8 years old, just roaming freely in the outside without parental interference. That was a lot of fun, and that was, I think, quite common for people in this era, but then things changed again. So we then, over the last 40 years or so, have kind of a return of more intensive parenting in many different places, in many different forms. So these keywords, helicopter parenting, tiger moms, kind of summarize that nowadays parents have become again, more intense, although in a somewhat different way compared to the old days. We haven't really gone back to beating children, but we're still a lot more intense than we used to be. If you don't know the Tiger Mom, so Amy Chua wrote this well-known book about Chinese parenting, and she has these recipes that sound quite drastic. For example, she says that her daughters, the two daughters, were not allowed to do anything such as having sleepovers, having play dates. They were not allowed to get any grades lower than an A, except in gym and drama, where it was actually wrong to get A's. They had to play piano or violin. That's the only instruments you can play, but those you have to play. So it was very prescriptive. And why is that? Well, Amy says that Chinese parents understand that you have to get good at stuff, you have to try a long time. But children don't want to work, so the only way to have success is to override the preferences and kind of force kids in one particular direction. And so it's a very different kind of parenting from what I experienced. Now, I should say the book is in fact quite entertaining. It's more of a memoir, and some of this is a bit of tongue-in-cheek. I think she does think that Chinese parents have some right ideas. It is not quite as extreme as it sounds here. But the book has a huge impact on society with now all of a sudden many parents kind of questioning, should I be more Chinese themselves? Is she maybe right? Should we really change our way of parenting, which my parents would have found very strange. So we see this change over time from very authoritarian to very relaxed to now more intense again in a somewhat different way. How does, I should also say this intensity is not just terms like helicopter parents. You can really measure it in the data. So this is data on time use. So this is a measure of how many hours per week parents spend on parenting. So interacting with their kids directly, to some extent basic childcare like changing diapers, but also talking with kids, doing homework, playing with kids. And you see that in all these countries, this has gone up enormously. United States, for example, moms used to do about 10 hours in the 70s, has gone to about 16 hours now, so 6% increase. Dads used to do essentially no parenting in the 70s, about 3 hours. Those guys were out playing golf on a Sunday. Now, they're still doing less, of course, than the moms by quite a large margin, but they're up to 8 hours. So it's almost a threefold increase in the time spent on parenting. So a lot more interaction between parents and kids, even though there's fewer kids. In the 70s, we still had families with 3 or 4 children, quite commonly. It was the end of the baby boom, whereas now 1 or 2 is the norm. And if you look in more detail what these parents are doing, you see that these activities that are more education-oriented, such as helping with homework, are the ones that grow the most. In fact, by a factor of about 3.5. In the 70s, in the time use, you see that the average family spent only 20 minutes per week on helping kids with homework, which means most families didn't do any of that. Just like my parents, they probably thought it wasn't for parents to help their kids, that's the kids' work. Now it's completely standard, that parents sit down with their kids and try to help them through these challenges. Okay, these are some facts we're trying to explain, and here's in one picture how we're going to think about where these changes come from. So we're going to argue that there's really 2 factors that are the most important for understanding these changes. Of course, there's many more. We're saying, generally speaking, that the entire environment you face matters, but we're going to argue that 2 aspects you can measure about the world are the most important. And these 2 aspects are over here, what we call children's independence, which is mostly a function of occupational mobility. So it's a question about whether the children are doing the same thing as the parent. If you have the same occupation, the same job, maybe you also live in the same place, or maybe you're in a world where children's lives are very different from what the parents had in their own adult lives. The second dimension is what we call the stakes, which is ultimately a function of inequality, so the gap between the rich and the poor, which closely relates to returns to education. How much better off are you going to be if you finish high school, finish college, get a higher degree, as opposed to just, say, dropping out of high school and starting to work at the factory. So these are factors that vary over time, and we argue they explain a lot about why parenting has changed. So let's put these different economic phases into this picture. I said for a very long time people were quite authoritarian, and we think of the authoritarian phase as being in the upper left over here. Why is it here? Well, if you think of children's independence, occupational mobility, that was actually very low because pretty much every child would do exactly the same thing that the parent has done. If you think about society before 1800, pretty much everybody was a farmer. Everything was about agriculture, and pretty much every farmer's son would be a farmer himself. Every farmer's daughter would be married to another farmer, so also doing kind of the same task that women would do at the time on the farm. So there would be essentially the same occupation, meaning the same knowledge the parent had would be relevant for the child. Now, if you want to be authoritarian, if you want to beat into your kid a certain way of doing things, you better know what that thing is. And back then they did, because the kids would do exactly the same thing that the parents had done. Another aspect is that you would live at home. You would not go to school, you would not go off to college, you would be living with your parents all the time. A second thing you need for authoritarian parenting is control. You have to be there, to be forceful, and of course that was also possible. So the fact that you had very low independence made authoritarian parenting possible, and the fact that you had very high inequality is what we argue made it desirable from the parent's perspective. What we mean by this is that you're in a society where the average income level is very poor. Until before industrialization, all societies were essentially at subsistence, where people barely had enough to eat to survive. Lifespans were quite short, and the gap between the rich and the poor was extremely wide. Now, what this means from your perspective as a parent, it means that if your child gets off the right path and somehow gets into trouble, it wouldn't just be an issue of getting bad grades or repeating a grade. It would probably be a matter of survival. If you have a son running away from home and thinking, I can do it on my own, well, there's some chance of success, but the probability of not finding a way to support yourself, getting some disease you can cure, and just dying would be quite high. Or think of some other aspect of behavior. Think of a daughter getting pregnant without being married at this time. You would not be able to marry. You would not be able to support this child. So the entire survival of your daughter and her child, of your family, would be at risk if the kids don't do what you think is right. And so you can kind of understand that loving parents, even though it sounds kind of wrong from today's perspective, but for them to be very forceful in saying, no, this is the one path for our family to survive. You have to do this, and if you don't, I'm going to be making sure you do. It is understandable given the huge stakes they faced and also the ability they had to be forceful in implementing their view. Now then the world changed. So we had industrialization, which changed many things. For example, it made occupational mobility much higher. Now it's very rare for children to have the same job as parents. It is also, even in the same job, the knowledge is changing very fast, so it's more difficult now to know what they need to know. If one of my sons were to be an economist, they would probably learn very different things from what I learned, because the world is changing so much faster now. A second thing is that nowadays so much important choices take place outside the home. The important things kids do, many of them happen in school or at college, where the parents are not really sitting there all the time. So independence is down. At the same time, inequality, at least for the first 150 years or so of industrialization, actually dropped tremendously. We came from this very high unequal phase in early society to very low inequality in the 60s and 70s. So we think of the permissive phase in parenting when I grew up as being down here, high independence, low inequality, and this is kind of what generates permissive parenting. Because you have no possibility of being authoritarian, given that the kids are somewhere else and learn very different things. At the same time, because the stakes are low, you don't really care that much about exactly what they're going to do. When you think about, say, my situation as a child back in Germany, if you at that time left school at 15 to work in a factory or become a carpenter, the income you would get would be essentially the same almost as that of a doctor or dentist or lawyer in German society at the time. The income gaps were very small. So parents didn't really worry that much about which grade of school their kids would get into, what kind of job they would get, because the possibility of a stable middle-class life would be very similar across all these different branches. You would care a lot more about what is right for them. If you have a kid that doesn't like math, that likes to work with their hands, you would say, well, fine, then do a more applied thing, become a carpenter, become a plumber, do something useful. Just as long as you're happy and can support yourself, that's fine with us. Even if you want to go to university, it didn't matter that much what grades you had. When I was a kid in high school in Germany, admission to university was open. You could go to any university, any program, independent of the grade. If you have a C- average in American terms, you could still go anywhere you want to. And if you think now about sitting there in 15 years old, should I study now 3 more hours for the math test tomorrow? or maybe do something more fun, be creative, have my own ideas. The trade-off is quite different compared to a kid nowadays, where the grades really do matter a lot for where you get to go and what your prospects are going to be. So we say that the stakes were low, and there's, it's important to keep in mind it's not just that the parents were lazy, it's a real trade-off, because there is a real benefit, I would think, to kids having independence and having their own experiences. Now, we would like for them to do this. It's just sometimes we wonder, can we really afford for them to be so much on their own? At the time, the trade-off was different. It was more affordable for the kids, for the parents to just let go and be off hands. And the world changed again. If you look at the last 40 years, the big economic change has been rising inequality. The gap between rich and poor has gone up in almost every country. The gap between what people with more and less education get paid has gone up. And this has made inequality a lot higher. So nowadays, in US society, it really does matter if your kid graduates from college or not, because the income gap between college grads and others are huge. There's also large gaps in many other outcomes, like marriage, like fertility, like health. So for parents to worry about how their kids do in education, it makes now a lot more sense than it used to. So this rising inequality, this huge range in possible outcomes, I think does explain why parents are now a lot more pushy. It's just they can't really do it in the old way because the authoritarian thing doesn't work if you have occupational mobility and high independence. The important decisions kids now have to make often are at university. I'm sure there's parents of my undergrad students at Northwestern who would love to come to class and sit next to their kids and say, put down that phone and listen to the teacher. But we don't allow them to do that. And so the only way to get the kids to really succeed is you can't really force them. You have to instill values in them that make them do this on their own. So you have to have a different parenting style that's more based on arguing, on explaining, on saying, this is the reason why education matters. Think about your future. Think about your choices. It's a different way of getting to the same aim of kids doing well, which is ultimately informed by a change in the economic environment. So this is how we think the world has changed and why these economic factors matter. Now, so far, it's just a story, and of course, for a story to make sense, you have to look at the data. So I'll show you just a few things about this data. Here's a picture of how inequality has changed. So to illustrate this change in over time that we think leads to more intensive parenting, the measure we focus on here is the income inequality measured by the ratio between the top 10% and the bottom 10% in the income distribution. So just sort all households in the United States by income, take the 10% richest and 10% poorest, and look at the ratio. It's been high, even in the 70s, about 9-1 in the United States, but it has since the 1970s more than doubled to now more than 18. Okay, so it's now really a huge gap between the rich and the poor. There's similar upward trends in other countries, even though not as pronounced as in the United States. Together with this is huge returns to education. So the income gap between college graduates and others is now about also 2-1. So it's now a huge chasm in income depending on your education. It didn't used to be this way. And this is what we argue over time explains why parenting has gotten more intensive. Now look at this picture. You can see a second thing, that even though the trend is upward everywhere, it's a global trend to more inequality, there's still huge differences across countries. So you see that our friends in Sweden have still much lower inequality than the US had even 40 years ago. The situation in the middle US is much higher. So if our story was true, if it's really the case that inequality, that rising stakes in parenting drives this new intensity, we should see the same differences we see in the US over time. We should also see them across countries today. It should be the case that the Americans are more intense than the Swedish are, for example. Now that's something, again, you can measure. The way we measure this, or one way in which we measure this, is using what's called the World Value Surveys, which is a survey where people in many countries are asked about their attitudes and views on many topics, including parenting. So one of the questions being asked there is, here's a list of values or qualities that you can emphasize in rearing children. Which of those do you find important? And these are values such as obedience, religiosity, but also, for example, hard work. Is it important for kids to learn to work hard to really apply themselves? If you ask American parents if hard work is important, you see that many of them think that's the case. Probably most parents at my school, at my kids' school, would agree to this. If I ask my undergrads, almost all of them say that hard work is important. But if you look across countries, you see that the answer to this question is actually vary tremendously in a way that's correlated with inequality. So here's a few of those questions for parenting across countries. I will focus on this one, hard work. So the fraction of parents that answer that hard work is important, here from 10% to 90%. The United States over here, so in the United States, you see about 2/3 of parents are going to say that hard work is an important value for kids to absorb. It's a very common parenting value, descriptive of the US parenting culture. On this axis over here, you have income inequality, so it's another measure of how unequal, how big the gap between rich and poor is, where a higher number here means more inequality. It's called the Gini coefficient. It's just a summary of this. And you see across this whole picture, this is a very clear and very almost linear relationship between the degree of inequality in a country and how many parents emphasize this value of hard work. So we have about 2/3 of parents saying hard work is important in the United States. In China, Russia, and Turkey, which are even more unequal, it is even higher. So in China, a bit like Amy Chu was saying, almost every parent is going to say hard work is really what parenting is about. But then you can go to other countries, for example, Sweden down here. In Sweden, it's only about 10%. In Sweden, it's actually very unusual. It's very rare for parents to say that kids should learn to work hard. And in fact, part of the motivation of this comes from having seen these places. For me to live for many years in Sweden, I used to visit him there for a month every year. If you talk to Swedish parents, it is not just that they have think it's not important. They really do think that American parents are crazy. That they think this American kind of high-pressure parenting is exactly wrong. They think that kids should be out in nature, roaming in the forest, and making their own experiences, and be left to grow up on their own. In Sweden, it's not just this value. It's also school starts at age 7. There's no grades for the first 5 years. It's really this view that kids should develop independently and be making their own experiences, and kind of parents should stand back and let things happen on their own. It's a very common view in Sweden, but this kind of graph suggests, well, maybe the low inequality is what makes this possible. That Sweden is a very low inequality society. The difference in outcomes across different occupations, different education levels are very small, and so it kind of makes sense for parents not to worry too much. If your kid doesn't do well in Swedish school, it is not really a big impact on the outcome. So we see this correlation between inequality and hard work. Of course, there's trade-offs in life. You cannot emphasize everything at the same time. If you are going to emphasize hard work, probably some other things will suffer. Here's some examples of this. Independence and imagination, also important values. And you see that countries that emphasize hard work emphasize those other values less. So in the United States, for example, only about 30% of parents think that imagination is an important value to emphasize. In Sweden, it's 60%. It's much more common for them to say that kids should have their own ideas, be creative, be imaginative, make their own discoveries compared to here. And that kind of, I think, illustrates this trade-off that these are also important values, but there's variation in how much we feel we can afford to emphasize these things. Okay, so this is, I think, a very interesting correlation. It's very strong. Of course, when you compare countries, you always have some doubts. Is this really the cause? Now, you might still think, well, maybe it is not so much the inequality that makes Sweden and the US and China different. Maybe it's just culture. Maybe there's something about Swedishness, and the Swedishness makes you just a relaxed parent. And maybe the Swedishness also makes you create institutions that lower inequality, but those things are really separate. It's not the inequality that is causing the change in the parenting. Okay? So those are interesting. Those are valid concerns. One way to address them is, as opposed to comparing countries across, is to look within countries over time. Just look at Swedish parents alone and see how within Sweden parenting changes as inequality goes up or down over time. Okay? Because then you look at a given society and see if there's a change too. If Swedishness itself matters, then it shouldn't be so important what inequality at a given moment of time. If inequality matters, you would think that within countries, inequality should drive parenting in just the same way as it does across countries. And so I won't show you the details of the statistics of this, but you can essentially study this by looking at change in parenting over time. Here's just one picture to illustrate the result of this. So what this picture shows you is an illustration of a statistical model that only looks at the effect of changing inequality within the country over time. So these yellow things over here, 75%, 25%, is the prediction for parenting styles, permissive, meaning kind of more relaxed, versus more American style, authoritarian or authoritative, In Sweden, given the actual distribution of characteristics such as family income, education, and also national inequality. Okay? And then we ask the question, well, if we now take this model based on Sweden, where we just trace out the change in inequality over time, but we now change the inequality in this model to the American level. So essentially we ask the question, take Swedish parents, the way they are right now, but just place them in society that has as much inequality as the United States. How much would their parenting change? And you see that if you plug this high inequality into the model, you get almost exactly the parenting styles you actually have in the United States. 28% versus 72%. Very few parents are relaxed. Most parents are very intense. So the variation in parenting in inequality within countries is essentially the same, having the same impact on parenting as across. So this is a statistical illustration. A different way of seeing the same point is to think also a bit about the history of parenting. You know, so I'm talking about Sweden here. I don't know if anybody here has read Astrid Lindgren's children's books. They're very popular in Germany. She's a writer of a children's book, mostly set in the 1940s in Sweden. And these are very beautiful books. It's the countryside. But if you look at the parenting in Astrid Lindgren's book, it's just as authoritarian as any German or American or French parent would have been at the time. You know, so one famous book is Michel, about this little boy living on a farm in Sweden, and every chapter is about him doing something he wasn't supposed to do. Every chapter ends with him beating by his dad and being locked up in a shed to think about his mistakes. You know? So it's just as authoritarian as anywhere else. It's not the case that the Swedish were always so so equality-minded and so different from us. And they were quite the same. It's economic changes that made them so different, we argue, more recently. Okay, so these are some illustrations to kind of show that this really works. Of course, there's many other things to look at, not just inequality. For example, also the education system matters a lot. You know, do you have tracking in the school system? Do you have high-stakes exams? Is it one exam that really determines your life, as opposed to a more mobile schooling system? Those things also matter, but economic inequality, we find, is the most important. I want to say a few more things about the question whether these things we observe here are something we should worry about. Well, there's some. Good. Are there some downsides to this modern trend to intensive parenting? You know? And there could be different downsides. You know, I've already mentioned this idea of a zero-sum race. It might be the case that people compete for some prize, like getting into Northwestern or some top college, and for this reason they jump through all these hoops that by themselves are not really that valuable. You know, you have all these top grades, you have all these extracurriculars, you do all this tutoring for the SAT. You know, does it really make society better? Maybe not. It makes sense for parents because the prize is there. But you might think it's a zero-sum race that doesn't really make us better. So that is one concern. And it's, I think, an important concern because it's really not just about the effort, which is maybe unpleasant. You know, it would be more fun to relax more. But it's also really having consequences for anxiety, for depression. And we see that rates of mental disease are have risen significantly for teenagers, for college students, partly as a result of this more intensive parenting. That is, I think, an important concern. I want to mention another one which I think is even more important, which is what we call the parenting gap. Now, if you think about the economics of parenting, but then you think, as opposed to just the average for our country, think about how does it affect inequality in parenting within the country? How does it affect the parenting of richer, well-off parents versus poorer parents? What you will see is that the same trends that make parenting get more inequality overall, that make parenting more intense overall, will also lead to a larger gap, more unequal parenting within the country. You know, so why is this? Well, to some extent, simply because parenting costs money. You know, if you think of private schools, tutoring, extracurriculars, you have to be able to pay for those. If the poor get poorer, the rich get richer, the ability to afford that will be different. But it's really not just money; it's also time. Because another thing that you see is that what upper middle class parents do these days is to pay other people to do things they would have done themselves in the 70s. You know, people used to change their own oil, they used to mow their own lawn, they used to cook a lot more. Now if you're well off, you pay often other people to do those things for you, to some extent to free up time to spend with your kids. You know, all these hours that people now spend on childcare, they have to come from somewhere. If you're wealthy, you're able to make this time. If you're less wealthy, maybe you have to have two jobs to get by. You're not going to be able to make those same investments. And it goes beyond that also. If you think about where people live, there's been more separation now between richer and poorer neighborhoods. Those things also matter for parenting. So these forces would predict that that the parenting gap, the difference in parenting across society, goes up over time, and the data does show that. And so here's the same time use I showed you before. So hours per week spent by mothers versus fathers, just in the United States. And you see in the 60s, 70s, early 80s, this was pretty much the same for more and less educated families. So more here means both parents have at least a college degree, and less, that's not the case. Whereas nowadays, there's a pretty large gap. So the more educated parents now spend a lot more hours per week interacting with their kids than the less educated parents do. They're reacting to the same changes, but one group is more able to adjust to this. If you look at spending on kids, things like schools, tutoring, and so on, it is even stronger. So there you see that the spending by the lowest quartile of the income distribution has actually gone down in real terms, kind of tracking the lower incomes of that group, whereas it's risen quite substantially for the upper middle class. So if you compare here now, really a huge gap in spending on kids, various aspects on spending compared to what we had in 1980. And there's many more. There is information on parenting styles, on school outcomes. I think I won't have time for this. Maybe you can talk about this later. But also a lot of evidence on this. Let me just say one word on this because I'm almost done. Because this is about difference across schools. So one thing you observe in the United States is that there's huge gaps in outcomes across different school districts, which of course correlate highly with inequality and wealth. So here's a picture from a recent study that shows you on this axis the essentially average income of parents in a school district. It's called socioeconomic status here, but it's a measure of income. And over here, on this axis, you have the success of those kids in middle school. So how are they compared to the national average? Here would be national average. 1 grade ahead, 2 grades ahead, 3 grades ahead, and so on. Glencoe, for example, fairly rich and fairly far ahead of the national average. If you look at this picture, you might be led to think it's really just that the schools are completely different. That some schools invest a lot, others invest little, and that the school is causing the outcome. But if you break this down within schools, you see that actually a lot of this income comes from the family income as opposed to the school spending. So this is an illustration of this. So this picture is the same thing. Here's socioeconomic status, and here's school performance. But now it breaks down within schools the performance of white, Hispanic versus black kids. And of course that correlates with income. And you see that in places where there's a lot of inequality across those groups, you see very large gaps in outcome. And I'm putting this here because I'm in Evanston, and this in fact happens to be the school district with the largest gap across these groups inside the school district. And so here over here that dot is the white kids in Evanston Middle School, and they are far ahead of national average. If you look at the black and Hispanic kids down here, they are just about at the average. So it's about a 3 to 4 grade spread of performance inside the school. And it's kind of what you would predict based on the average income of these parents, because white parents on average are relatively rich and well educated, and whereas the black and Hispanic families are, not poor overall, but they are kind of more national average. And what this suggests is that these differences are not really about the schools, they're more about the parental income. And you can actually trace this out. What you see in the average schools is that these gaps across parents from different income groups, they are there in kindergarten. They're there at the very beginning, and then over time, these different groups learn more or less at the same rate. So per year of schooling, they get the same advantage, the same growth in knowledge. It's just the initial gaps are very large and don't go away. This is suggestive of a lot of these gaps not really being about school spending, really being more about the first 4 or 5 years, which we now have learned are kind of the most formative, and where these differences in parenting kind of have the largest impact. And this is another illustration of these parenting gaps really mattering. Okay, so that is, I think, what comes out of this research is the most worrying, that we have, for economic reasons, a large gap in parenting, and it's worrying because that gives us the concern that inequality will get even worse in the future. We have had 40 years of rising inequality with quite dramatic economic, also political implications if you think of the polarization we are currently observing. But it's important to keep in mind that currently, the people who are currently in the labor force, where we measure this inequality with, they've been still raised in the previous generation under more equal conditions. Whereas the next generation that's being raised now has now very unequal starting conditions for richer and poorer families, which would suggest that social mobility might go down even more, inequality might go up even more than it has so far. So there's a real concern that inequality becomes self-reinforcing because of this gap in opportunity for different families. That's a concern, but I think there's also a hopeful message, because the other thing that the research suggests is that these outcomes, what parents do and what parenting is like in general, in fact, is not set in stone at all. It is very reactive to what the economic environment looks like. It is totally different now from when I was a child, just a few decades ago. It is very different across countries in a way that responds very systematically to what the environment looks like. And that suggests if we are concerned about this, as we are, then we can learn from other times and other countries where we have different outcomes for what institutions might be successful in lowering these parenting gaps and preventing some of these less desirable outcomes from happening. And so I won't talk about details, but you can start with early childhood education. You can start about family support. You can think about vocational training. There's many different aspects of what's different about societies, what's different about policies that maps very clearly into parenting, and so that gives you essentially a tool set for addressing some of these concerns. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. There's more stuff in the book, but I won't talk about that. Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for a great talk. Okay, so the argument you're making in the book is that the reason for the parenting styles are the economic forces that the parents are perceiving and processing. But my question is, does it work? I mean, does this intensive parenting, in fact, accomplish the results that the parents think are going to be accomplished, or are the results simply due to the fact that the kids are growing up in these families, and even if the parents dial down their intensiveness by like a factor of 10, the results will still be the same?
That's a great question, because for this to really make sense, it better be the case that there is some relation between the parenting and the outcome. And you can never know these things for sure, because to know for sure, you would want to do an experiment where you randomly assign parenting styles. You are authoritarian and you just let go, and we're not allowed to do that, and it would be also hard to convince parents to do that. But we can still look at the data, and the data does suggest, I think quite strongly, that it does work in the limited sense that you get what you're looking for, namely more success in measurable ways, such as test scores and schooling. So if you look at, you can do this in many data sets, many countries. If you compare the more intense, more education-oriented parents to the ones who are more relaxed, holding constant other things like family income, education, of course, that matters a lot on its own. You do find that the more intensive parents have kids who get higher test scores, who are more likely to finish high school, who are more likely to graduate from college, and more likely to get higher education. And in fact, these effects are larger when you look at families where the likelihood of success was lower to begin with. So if you take two parents, both have college degrees or higher education, probably you can be fairly relaxed and your kids will still do well, because there's also a lot that just transmit directly in the family. You see the example of the parents. It's not that easy, to kind of mess up in a big way. But if you think about families that are further away from education, say two parents who didn't go to college at all, so for their kids it actually matters a huge amount. So if you look at kids who say go beyond a BA, get a master's or MBA or medical degree, among parents who did not have much education, there it's very predictive. So it's really much higher probability for the more intensive parents than for others. Now, I should say, this is what we can measure. I think the concern is what about the stuff we can't measure? Because you might also think there's returns to things like creativity and independence, that are also valuable, but that doesn't show up in test scores or graduation rates. So there's trade-offs. It's just in terms of the measurable stuff, I think it works that way.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I love economics. I was a BA in economics. You get taxation on one of the last impacts of what and it started in the late 60s, 70s, and I correlate that kind of to the introduction or adoption of the Laffer curve by the Republican Party over the past, since 1980, and the movement of corporations away from moral running of their corporations and just true maximization of profit, which leads to a great bit of our inequality. What do you compared cultures kind of, but what is the impact of not having morals in our economic theory and how it impacts education in kids?
And so some part of this rise in inequality has to do with the fact that say big corporations used to provide fairly secure employment, often lifetime employment, for a wide range of workers from different educational backgrounds. In the 60s, you would start to work at AT&T or Ford or IBM and kind of expect to be there a very long time and be more protected, whereas now it's a bit more, you get minimum wage and very low employment security, and so you don't have quite the same prospect. And these things matter a lot, and taxation does matter. We don't put taxation at the very top of our list because from the research, we see that what really seems to be the most important is the very early years. And there it's not just taxation, it's also things like direct support for children, welfare support for children, that matters a lot. And so one thing that has happened, for example, is that welfare reform now puts very strong work requirements with single moms. So often they have to work many hours to support themselves, which makes, of course, the childcare quite difficult. And one thing you see also in the data is that in the United States, outcomes for kids of single moms are quite a bit worse than for kids from intact families. Which is actually not the case in many European countries. So there's some effect, but the difference between single moms and otherwise similar married couples are very small, say in Germany or France or Sweden. And for that reason, the first thing we talk about is things like early childhood education and support for families with young kids. But these factors you mentioned are also quite important.
I'm really kind of curious about what the book, what your intent of the book is. It's always been shown that children of wealthy children do better, and that's been true in almost any culture over any time period. I'm trying to figure out who the book is for, and is there anything more that you're actually trying to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so of course it's always the case. There's many reasons why better off parents tend to have kids that they're better off themselves. Many channels of transmissions. What we're saying is that still the strengths of transmission can vary quite a bit across time and space. For example, in the United States, we have seen that social mobility has gone down over time. So now the probability for kids to do better, have a higher income than their parents is a lot lower than it was 40, 50 years ago. So even though there's always a correlation, the strength of this correlation varies quite a bit across time and space. And what we're trying to argue is this is not something that's just unavoidable or kind of a deep feature of our times. It's really a function of choices and about how institutions inform those choices. So to say that what seems, because as a parent, it often seems like you have no choice. You kind of live in this society and everybody is doing one thing and you feel you kind of have to adopt that norm too. But kind of doing this comparison really does show you that there's a huge variation that depends on how we design the society. Kind of, and showing this mapping is really what we wanted to do.
Thank you for your talk. I noticed that some of the curves that you had seem to have bends or inflection points at certain years. Mm-hmm. Can you tease out events like the dot-com bust or mortgage crisis and see responses of parents in that?
Yes, it's a little hard to do because we see changes in the economic environment and they might have some impact. But of course, parents are in a way less informed by what's happening right now and more by what the expectations are for the future. And so you think, what I think the world will be like in 20, 30 years, that is what informs my thinking. And that, of course, does depend on economic changes happening right now, but maybe not in the most direct way. So you're right that there are some kinks in the curve that are interesting, but we weren't really successful in finding particular events happening at that time. I think it's a bit more that it takes time for a new reality to set in and for people to really understand that the world has changed. It isn't just my life. It is a national trend, and for this to enter the conversation, and I think that's the time when parents really do think, well, I have to do something else now.
Yeah, I had a question. Have you looked at whether the enrollment in, say, liberal arts versus hard sciences had changed over that period with more?
Yes. Yeah, it did. So we don't talk about this in this book, but it's another aspect of this drive to college. So we talk in general about that the return to college has gone up a lot, but as it has gone up, people also, I think, realize more that, in fact, it's hugely heterogeneous across schools, but also across majors, and so you find that certain majors, including economics, but also computer science, hard sciences, they have fairly high economic returns, whereas, say, liberal arts degrees, English literature, have much lower returns, and so, and that's probably okay, because you might think, well, I'm following my passion, it's something I want to do, I don't care so much about the money, but again, if the income gaps grow, then inevitably, the monetary side becomes a bigger impact on the trade-off. And we do see, indeed, that in school, the fraction of kids going to different majors has changed, and going towards the more economically successful majors. Like recently, now everybody knows data science is big, and so now those programs are getting huge interest from undergrads, and more traditional fields are withering a little bit. Another impact of the same change.
I would think that family size would affect parenting and the opportunities that you could give your children. So I wonder why you didn't include access to birth control and abortion and statistics on family size in your book.
Yes.
Or your program.
So I fully agree, and in fact we have a chapter on fertility too. It's just limited time, so I didn't focus on this here. When we talk about fertility, our view is that maybe access to abortion and birth control isn't the main factor, because in many of these places that access is fairly equal, and we still see huge differences in fertility rates. Of course, there's cases where birth control matters a huge amount. If you think about Ireland, for example, where it was fairly drastic, that's the case. But the data also does support, I think, what you're suggesting is that the intensity of parenting also affects choice of family size. Now, if you think I really have to do all these things for my kids to have a fair chance, then my likelihood of having 3 or 4 or more kids might be lower. And we do indeed see that the countries with the most intensive parenting cultures in the world have extremely low fertility rates. China, you saw that on the graph, is maybe the most intense country right now, and they now have real concerns about shrinking population, because most families have just one kid. It used to be a policy, now it's not, but they still stick to this very low family size, I think, in response to these incentives. Even the United States, which used to be a bit higher fertility, had a drop in fertility about 10 years ago in the Great Recession, which hasn't come back up. So now we're at about, on average, 1.7 kids per woman. So also now on a path to shrinking population, and I do think that the higher demands of parenting is definitely an important reason for that.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I'm also sort of an economist, and when my kids were little, I at some point said to a colleague, I figured out that 99% of parenting is helping your kids get a sensible discount rate. Right. And that's sort of the marshmallow thing. The kid who waits to get the second marshmallow does better than the kid who ate the marshmallow right away, right? But listening to you makes me think a little bit about the endogeneity of discount rates across generations. So I valued, doing these things and delaying gratification to invest in schooling, whatever. I convey that to my kids, and I feel like there's some sort of the discount rate thing across generations, and how much will that break down? How much of that is a function of what success looks like as we parameterize it here and as we've experienced it, and in a world where success will look different, possibly with whatever environmental change and with class warfare or whatever, will the value of the discount rate have maybe been misguided? Right,
yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree. I mean, if you think about the one thing that really is the aspect of attitudes that you emphasize, I think this is exactly the one. So there's the marshmallow part, kind of the delay of gratification. I think there's also a second aspect to patience, which is more long run, because to to be patient, you kind of have to have the ability to even imagine what are the consequences of my choice today for the long-term outcomes. And if you think of middle-class families, without even thinking about it, it's what we do all the time, to kind of link what you're doing in school right now to what's going to happen in high school, to what your life is going to be like. But this is not something that you're born with. This is something that you absorb over time, and that varies, I think, quite a bit across different groups in society. Now, it's hard to measure discount rates very well, and so in terms of change over time, we don't really have very good data. One thing we've done in the past in a separate piece of research is instead of looking at countries over time, look at different groups within a society. And so an interesting example for that is early society, because nowadays in modern society, success comes from making money. And so it's the patient people who are a bit more likely to be at the top of the income scale. But if you think about pre-industrial society, the people at the top were the aristocracy, and for them, patience wasn't that important because they had all the land, they got income on their own, and that actually didn't make them very forward-looking, because for them, applying themselves, working hard at a young age, wasn't the same necessity compared to somebody from the middle class who had to, say, be an apprentice or learn something at university. And the evidence, I think, is quite clear that the aristocracy, in fact, was a lot less patient. If you watch Downton Abbey, you'll find them losing all their fortune every other episode and then somehow being rescued by some miracle. And it wasn't just them, it was really a trend where the majority of these aristocratic families lost all their wealth and got too much debt because they didn't really plan for the future as much as others would have done. It's very much indicative that the economic situation of these families made them emphasize different values that ultimately led to their downfall.
Thanks for the talk. Sort of related to what you were just saying, I was wondering what the role of income mobility is separate from income inequality, and whether that's just an outcome or whether it's also something that determines parenting styles.
Yeah, I think they're closely related because when you think about where your kid will be, the possibility of mobility plays a role. And here essentially we are thinking that that if you educate more, you have a higher probability of moving up, for your kids to move up, and so mobility and inequality are kind of closely linked. There could be situations where that's not the case. So if there's barriers to mobility that are not just about education, but just about, say, social class, or think of India, it's about caste, that there's things you can do independently of how well you do in education, that would also have additional impacts. So if you're in a society that has high inequality, but even if you try hard, you can't move up because you're not allowed to, given who you are, then of course it will have repercussions for parenting. And so in a place like that, where there's additional mobilities for barriers to mobility, we would also expect to see repercussions for parenting.
Have you included children with disabilities in your studies and results?
Yes. No, we haven't, and it's essentially lack of space because there's. I think any parent who has more than one kid knows that kids are tremendously different. And certainly another thing that matters a lot is what parenting style actually works for a particular kid. And in my family there's a lot of dyslexia. And so then kind of what parenting you're going to engage in, or kind of what path you think is the best, is also going to be a function of that. So certainly there's a huge impact on what your child is like in many dimensions on what parenting you're going to do. And there's also going to be impact of the economic environment on what the relative opportunities are depending on what your background is.
Thank you for the talk. For all of the interested parents and future parents in the room, I know with economics we can see all kinds of different trends, and there's a lot of optimization questions. So it's all right if I ask, what are some of the benchmarks that you look for in terms of what kind of income, what kind of hours per day, how many kids? If we look at, because for example, we know that in the United States they say about a $60,000 a year income, you stop worrying. Most families can stop worrying about day-to-day expenses, and their quality of life goes up significantly. But at 70,000, the difference is not significant. So about 60,000, that money buys happiness kind of levels out. What are the income and hourly attention benchmarks that you saw in your study that, with this many hours and this much income, kids really started to see a benefit, and much more than that, it kind of started to peter out.
Right. Yeah, those things are not that easy to do, because we don't really get to experiment. So we know broad parenting styles having some impact on outcomes, but it's hard to tell things apart because they all come together. Like families that spend time playing with their kids, doing homework, they also have meals together. They discuss politics. Which of those different things is really driving the result is kind of hard to tell. We have the general intuition that parenting matters a lot in terms of meeting a certain threshold, as opposed to as much as you can possibly can. So if you look, for example, at studies with early education for disadvantaged children, you see that the effect of some intervention where you say teach the parents more about how to interact with their kids in the best way, you have the biggest effects for the worst of parents. Where you think that going from doing almost nothing to a minimum is hugely important, and then at the top end maybe it's not making that much of a difference anymore. But it's hard to tell, because there's so many things we do and there's so many outcomes we can look at, and so it's difficult for a parent to be kind of really sure kind of what the right level is. And in the data, we do see that the anxiety level of parents isn't really going down as they get richer. And you might think if you're really well off, you shouldn't worry so much. Then you see the college admissions cheating scandal, and you realize that even at the very top, people worry a lot. And of course, there's also the element that a lot of the measurement of success is relative. People worry about the relative income of their parents to their own income. If you're very rich, you worry maybe more about decline than other people do, and you might get even more anxious about it, even though maybe you shouldn't.
Hi. Do you look at all at any disparities between racial background within the same socioeconomic tier?
Yes, we do. We look a bit at this. We don't really have a final answer for where they come from. So there's clearly large differences by race. A large part of those I have to do with income. I showed you earlier this picture of achievement in school, and you see that they vary across racial groups, but in a way that's mostly explained by income. So conditional income, the Hispanic, Black, Asian, white difference isn't that large. There is, in fact, what does stick out the most, maybe having to do with immature, is that controlling for everything else, Asian American, is giving you very good outcomes. And why is that? Of course, you might again say it's culture, but perhaps more important is that in most cases it's also an immigrant experience. And of course, being an immigrant is also a special situation for many reasons. And to some extent because often the parents didn't have the same opportunities that their kids will have in the new place. And so for them to emphasize the kids a lot more than maybe their own being is a natural choice. There's also selection, kind of who is going to immigrate to a new country. Probably people who value a lot, that my kids should have the best opportunities are more likely to go to a new country, and that will have some impact. So my sense would be that income plus selection into immigration actually explains for a lot of this, but that's something we still, I think, need to learn more about.
Thank you for your talk. Could you say a little bit more about the relationship between school funding and inequality? Mm-hmm. The one instance you mentioned in Evanston kind of seemed to point, as you just were talking about, between income differences. But did you see any sort of difference in the relationship between school funding and the cause of inequality?
Right. Mm-hmm. So there's no question that outcomes across schools differ a lot. The question that I was kind of raising with this picture is what is the root cause of that? Is it because of how much you spend on the school? Is it because of the teachers? Is it because of the families that live in that place? And the evidence I was showing you kind of is suggestive that the families matter a lot. Because otherwise, if it was just a school, you wouldn't expect to see these huge gaps within the school. So people who've been together in the same place for a very long time. The other thing that I think matters a lot beyond school funding is peer groups. So I've talked about this vision of parents kind of shaping their children, which can be done to some extent. But of course, the other side is that, especially as they get older, once they become teenagers, they're actually not that easy to access for the parents. It's a lot more about the peer group. But then these schools differ tremendously in what these peer groups are. In some neighborhoods, you're going to have only kids in middle school or high school that have this plan too, of going off to college and doing great things in the economy. And you might have others from disadvantaged backgrounds where many kids just don't have that same perspective. And so that peer group could also have a big impact. So I'm worried about school funding, but I think I'm even more worried about the increased income segregation in terms of where people live. So that now the peer groups differ so much across different schools, more so than they used to.
And this will be our last question.
Another trend that's happened maybe over the past several decades is that jobs are hyper-specialized and technology is just getting more and more complex, and it's just creeping into like every part of our life. So I'm wondering how that kind of fits into the analysis you have.
So I think the changing role of technology is one reason why the return to education is high, to deal with all this frequent change. Having a good, well-educated background and some flexibility to change is important. It's also part of the reason why it's very difficult for parents to directly help their kids, and they have to rely more on values. So given how fast technology is changing, it would be very difficult for me to help my kids with the math or computer science they have to do, and so that makes values even more important. It makes also flexibility very important, because these changes are happening at a rate where you expect you will probably have to change your career a couple of times throughout your life, as opposed to doing the same thing all the time. Again, that makes being well educated, having a strong background to make these changes more important. So I think it's another aspect that underlies a rising intensity of parenting.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for everyone.